Hello there, you're watching Debrief on CNN News 18. I'm Maha Siddiqui. Ominous war clouds are looming over Ukraine. American National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has also sounded an alarm, saying that Russia can invade Ukraine anytime now. But Russia outrightly rejects it has any such intention. But Ukraine is getting more anxious by the day over Russia's military buildup and has asked for talks with Moscow within 48 hours, even as the German Chancellor steps into avert a war. At a time when the world is barely out of the economic loss and loss of lives from the COVID-19 pandemic, can it afford a war? Will diplomacy and dialogue be able to avert this crisis? Or with Russia's military buildup and America's progressively shrill warnings, both sides are simply sizing each other up? We'll try to answer some of those questions over the next half an hour in Debrief. Over 1 lakh Russian troops continue to be stationed at Ukraine's border. The US says the invasion could happen any day now. Multiple countries have asked their citizens to leave, even as hectic parleys are on to defuse the situation. CNN's John Loring with this report.
6 months.
President Joe Biden spoke with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky Sunday, promising to respond swiftly and decisively if Russia takes further action against Ukraine.
An invasion could begin, a major military action could begin by Russia in Ukraine any day now. That includes this coming week before the end of the Olympics.
The talk with Zelensky comes one day after Biden warned Russian President Vladimir Putin in a phone call with swift and severe costs if Ukraine is invaded.
We are prepared with a package of potential economic consequences that will hit many of those oligarchs and make clear to Russia that there are real costs to pay for this.
Although preparations are underway, including the U.S. providing Ukraine with 180 tons of ammunition, the White House and some top lawmakers are hoping for a peaceful resolution.
The best thing that could happen is for us to pass a sanctions package, pre-invasion with a waiver, post-invasion sanctions, that would destroy the ruble and cripple the Russian economy, so Putin could see it in writing. That might help him decide not to invade.
Some analysts say Putin could punish himself if he goes ahead with military action.
It might strengthen ties between Ukraine and the European Union. It also has created a stronger sense of Ukrainian national identity. And it's hard for me to see how that helps either Mr. Putin or Russia.
All right, so let's take a look now at why Ukraine is worried and seeking more military and financial help to defend itself. Let's begin with Ukraine's eastern border. This is the Donbass, as it's called, where the Russian troops are amassed in huge numbers. The count is estimated to be around 1,20,000 troops or over 1 lakh troops definitely in this region. This is the eastern part of Ukraine. And now if we come to the south, this is the Crimean Peninsula. This was a part of Ukraine annexed by Russia in 2014. There are forces here as well, the Russian forces here as well. And now let's cut across to the north, and you can see right on top over there in purple, Belarus. There again, Russian forces at the moment. So on three sides, possibly all the places Russia could surround Ukraine, their forces are there. The other side, of course, is start of the EU. So that is one of the reasons why Ukraine at the moment is certainly worried. Let me now go across to Fred Plechin, senior international correspondent of CNN, who is stationed in Moscow at the moment. Fred, Jake Sullivan is saying an invasion by Russia into Ukraine could be any time now. Is Russia still continuing to deny any such designs? Has there been any statement from Moscow after Sullivan's assessment?
Yeah, there certainly have, and the Russians are continuing to deny that they want to invade Ukraine. It's quite interesting because the U.S. says that they have seen further troop movements by the Russians towards the border with Ukraine. And they also say they believe that the posture they're seeing from those Russian forces indicate that an invasion could happen at any time if it is ordered by Vladimir Putin. Now, the Russians, especially after that phone call between Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden, have said that they believe all of this is hysteria on the part of the United United States and its allies. In fact, a senior aide to Vladimir Putin said that it's reached the climax of hysteria. The Russians are continuing to deny that they are planning an invasion, that they want to invade, but they also say that they want these talks with the United States to continue, and they say that they've put forward demands to the U.S. and its allies, security demands, as they put it, and they said so far the U.S. and its allies haven't answered. So certainly it's hard to see that there could be any sort of de-escalation at this point in time, but the Russians certainly are continuing to deny that they have plans to invade Ukraine.
Fred, then what explanation does Moscow have for the build-up at the border with Ukraine and also in Crimea and Belarus? It does appear to have surrounded Ukraine. What is it for then?
Well, it's surrounded Ukraine from several sides. You're absolutely right that they have certainly built up forces, as far as the U.S. says, in Crimea, considerable amount of forces, also towards the eastern part of Ukraine, and then also in the north of Ukraine with those large-scale exercises going on between Russian and Belarusian forces in Belarus at the moment. So there is a very large Russian troop deployment that does seem to be there. And the Russians have explained a lot of this with exercises that are going on. In fact, right now there are naval exercises that are going on in the Black Sea with 30 Russian vessels that are involved. Strangely, some of those vessels seem to be amphibious assault vessels, which obviously are used to then go on land and bring tanks, armored vehicles, and soldiers on land. And then obviously you have those big exercises that are going on in Belarus as well. So the Russians have declared some of their buildup with exercises that have been pending, but they also, with other parts of the troop deployments, really haven't offered very much of an explanation, especially if you look at the troop deployments that the Russians appear to be conducting in the southwest of Russia.
Fred, many thanks for joining us with all those details. So how is Ukraine bracing up as Russia exerts force? Ukrainian forces in the nation's eastern region are constantly aware that Russian forces are close, armed, and ready to move at any moment. CNN senior national security correspondent Alex Marquardt traveled to the cold, desolate area, and here's his report.
Flying low over the Ukrainian countryside, this Soviet-era military plane heads toward the border with Russia. We traveled here with senior Ukrainian officials and military leaders to get a sense of the mood and preparations where Russian troops are the closest, near Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. This is Avdiivka, where many of these Ukrainian troops, who are mostly young men, have been fighting Russian-backed forces on this cold and desolate front.
Go!
They're eager to show us how they've been living and fighting here in a conflict involving Russia that has been largely forgotten, but which has taken over 14,000 lives in the past 8 years, according to the United Nations. Ivan has been here the whole time. Like the other soldiers here, he says they're confident they could face a new Russian invasion.
Of course, we're ready for some bad situation, and we basically wait here.
Do you think that will happen, this bad situation?
I'm not, I don't know, because I don't know what in the head of the guys in that territory.
But for you, the war has already started.
Of course.
We're taken to the farthest point forward, where sandbags and tires are piled high. Then,
so there was just a burst of what sounded like automatic gunfire. We are just 70 meters, we are told, from the fighters on the other side of the front line.
We're rushed away, our escorts keen for us to see what happens, but not too closely.
Hearing this gunfire and being so close to this front line, you can't help but think that even if diplomacy succeeds in preventing Russia from invading Ukraine yet again, this fighting, which has been raging since the last time Russia invaded Ukraine, will almost certainly continue.
NATO leaders say that ending the fighting already happening here is a critical part of preventing further Russian aggression. With NATO so far refusing to send troops to Ukraine to fight, Ukraine insists it needs more help.
But the important issue, what they need, is additional weapons assistance from the West, from our Western allies, potentially financial assistance. That's what we need to make sure that we will defend not only peace in this country, but peace in Europe.
As if to punctuate their point, more gunfire rings out.
John.
But while the Russian forces clearly are large in number at the eastern border with Ukraine, and as we were pointing out, also in Crimea and in Belarus, Russia continues to deny that there are any intentions of Russia to invade Ukraine. Let's take a listen in to what Vladimir Putin had to say.
Министерство иностранных дел России представит свои соображения по поводу ответов, которые мы получили на наши предложения, направленные американским коллегам в Вашингтон и коллегам из Североатлантического альянса в Брюссель, по поводу организации вопросов, связанных с безопасностью в Европе, и ответа на наши озабоченности, связанные с бесконечным, на наш взгляд, и очень опасным расширением НАТО на восток, теперь уже и за счет бывших республик Советского Союза, включая и Украину.
Let's now jog you back into history so that you get a better sense of why Vladimir Putin there was talking about talks with NATO as well. And this will be better explained by explaining the concept of how Ukraine came about. Let's try and understand the linkages as well between Russia and Ukraine. They are not merely neighboring countries. Ukraine was once part of USSR and gained independence as the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, much of the fight over whether Ukraine can or should join the NATO also emerges from that point, as the Ukrainian constitution, its preamble, talks about NATO. However, Russia has a serious problem with NATO moving eastwards. NC Satpathy explains now these linkages between Russia and Ukraine that still exist and make this entire situation even further complicated.
The world's biggest superpowers during the Cold War are at loggerheads once again in the 21st century. And at the center of this tug of war is this nation, Ukraine. Located in Eastern Europe, Ukraine is the second largest country in the continent in terms of area and seventh largest in population, sharing its borders with both the European Union and Russia. Its capital is Kyiv, located on the Dnieper River. For long, Ukraine has been dominated by Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the USSR. Ukraine joined the Soviet Union in 1922 and was one of its original constituents. In 1990, Ukraine declared sovereignty as the Soviet Union began to disintegrate. With the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991, Ukraine gained full independence. In the process, it also gained 5,000 nuclear arms that had been parked by Russia on its soil, becoming only the third nuclear power nation in the world. But Ukraine also turned over thousands of lethal weapons in exchange for security guarantees from Russia. Kiev has retained its deep social and cultural ties with Moscow. Russian remains widely spoken in the country. Many of Ukrainian citizens bear family ties with Russia and vice versa. But family ties mean nothing on a world map. In 2014, Ukrainians were left shell-shocked when Russia annexed its southern peninsula of Crimea as an act of retaliation to the deposition of a pro-Moscow president. Russia has started backing separatists to control large areas of eastern Ukraine. Since then, the fight has claimed more than 14,000 lives. Even the international community hasn't been spared, with Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 being infamously gunned down over the region in 2014, killing all 298 on board. The standoff has hurt Ukraine badly, having already faced an economic meltdown after the Soviet collapse. In terms of GDP, Ukraine is 23rd in Europe, and its per capita income is one of the poorest in the continent. But with Russia now surrounding Ukraine with its military presence in multiple locations, in Crimea, Belarus, and the eastern part of the country, it seems this European battlefield is now facing a slow choke. With NC Satpathy, Ritanshu Bhattacharya for CNN News 18.
India was one of the first countries to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign country in December 1991. Diplomatic relations were established in 92 and Ukraine opened its first embassy in Asia in 93, and that was in New Delhi. This explains the history of India's relationship with Ukraine. But right now, what weighs heavy on India's mind is how to balance its equation with both Russia and the US as the crisis flares. An old ally of India, Russia, that has been uncomfortable with New Delhi's growing proximity to Washington, D.C., and India's continued effort to strike a balance between old friends and new. That being put to test again as the Ukraine crisis flares up.
We have been closely following the evolving developments relating to Ukraine, including through ongoing high-level security talks between the Russian Federation and the United States. India's interest is in finding a solution that can provide for immediate de-escalation of tensions.
Even as India abstained from voting on a discussion on Ukraine in the United Nations Security Council, Russia said that it was a stand in its favor. Meanwhile, India's purchase of S-400 missile defense system has also come under the Ukraine crisis scanner. US has already imposed Katsa sanctions on its NATO ally Turkey for a similar purchase, despite insisting that the idea is not to penalize allies and partners.
It shines a spotlight on the destabilizing role that Russia is playing not only in the region, but potentially beyond as well. Whether it is India, whether it is any other country, we continue to urge all countries to avoid major new transactions for Russian weapon systems.
And it's not just the geopolitical ramifications. If tensions go up, there will be no comfort in distance for India either. Escalation in the Ukraine crisis will be a slippery road for India too. The fuel price rise last year that had started to burn a hole in the pocket of the middle-class India was only reined in late last year due to domestic political compulsions. But once state elections are over, that may no longer be a constraint. The current Ukraine tension plus the situation in West Asia with the Houthi, UAE and Saudi Arabia in a tangle, the Brent prices went up as high as $90 a barrel 3 weeks ago. US, Russia and Saudi Arabia are the top 3 oil-producing countries. Any disruption in the supply chain will hit the high energy-consuming India. Fuel prices will not be the only worry. Ukraine is also India's biggest supplier of sunflower oil. India imports 70% of its cooking oil. Ukraine and Russia together supply 80% of the sunflower oil globally. Supply chain disruptions could see cooking oil prices rise as well. There are around 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine and professionals from IT, pharma, engineering and medicine. The Indian embassy in Kyiv has already collected details of Indian citizens but has not pressed the panic button yet, like the West. In case of any exigency though, their safe repatriation too will be a matter to deal with for India. Maha Siddiqui, CNN News 18. Nord Stream 2 has been in the headlines after the Polish Prime Minister described it as a gun in the hands of Vladimir Putin. CNN's Bianca Nubilo explains what the Nord Stream 2 is and why it's being talked about in the midst of the Ukrainian crisis, and why it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince Germany that will be a beneficiary of Nord Stream 2, with over millions of homes receiving energy through this pipeline.
I want to take a closer look at Nord Stream 2. It's made a lot of headlines this week, with the Polish Prime Minister describing it as a gun in the hands of Putin. So what exactly is it? Nord Stream 1 is a gas pipeline running from Western Russia all the way to Germany under the Baltic Sea. It was completed in 2012 and has an annual capacity of 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year, meaning that it can power around 26 million homes. Nord Stream 2, owned by Gazprom, runs parallel to Nord Stream 1. The $11 billion project was completed in 2021, but German regulators haven't issued the final sign-off that's needed for it to start operations. Now, this has huge geostrategic implications. It works for Russia because Russia can sell gas directly to its biggest European customer, Germany, bypassing all these transit countries, saving itself a lot of money. Plus, the more European countries get gas from Russia, the more they rely on Russia, and that's leverage. When it comes to Germany, the new coalition government has a range of views on Nord Stream, but the country needs reliable and affordable gas supplies as gas prices soar and renewables are just not generating enough yet. But the US sees potential for exploitation. Their concern is that Russia will seek to undermine energy and national security all over Europe. As for Ukraine, President Zelensky has called Nord Stream a dangerous geopolitical weapon. Nord Stream 1 already bypasses Ukraine. Add another pipeline, and Ukraine stands to lose hundreds of millions, if not billions, of remaining gas transit fees that it used to get when Russia transported gas through its territory to other countries. And amid tensions between Russia and Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 has been identified by the US and UK governments, among others, as a key bargaining chip and a point of pressure to deter Russia from invading Ukraine, at least until the gas taps turn on.
And remember now, it's the German Chancellor who's going to be stepping in now to try and avert a crisis. We'll be talking to Moscow about the situation that looms large over Ukraine. Meanwhile, after several days of diplomacy to avert armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, CNN's Melissa Bell reports on a critical factor that can actually affect any prospect of a ground war in the region, and that's the weather.
Across much of Ukraine, it's been a mild winter. Still plenty of snow, but much of it turning to slush. The Sea of Azov, less icy than normal for the beginning of February. According to the latest data, temperatures are running between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius higher than the 30-year average. And that just might make a difference to any Russian military offensive.
For him to move in and occupy the whole country, particularly from the north, from Belarus, he's going to have to wait a little bit till the ground's frozen.
The view in Washington is that a Russian offensive needs frozen ground, given Ukraine's landscape.
Prominent terrain includes flat, open plains, and there are abundance of rivers and lakes, and there's a high water table. And when that high water table freezes, it makes it for optimal conditions for cross-country tracked and wheeled vehicle maneuver.
It's not so much that modern tanks get bogged down in wet conditions, but the support they need can do.
More importantly than the tracked vehicles themselves is what they need to sustain themselves, which is fuel and ammunition, which are very heavy and are generally carried by wheeled vehicles that need good roads.
Even the Russians admit that in some areas, wet conditions can be a factor.
If you studied geography of the area, actually the southern part of Belarus, close to the Ukrainian border, is a very swampy area which is hardly fitting for certain active engagement of tanks and other heavy weaponry.
It's not just the conditions on the ground, it's the skies as well. Clear skies are important for reconnaissance and intelligence gathering and for landing assault troops.
Cloudy weather, rain, snow, all of that would inhibit the reconnaissance measures that you would use to find the targets. And if you can't find the targets precisely, then the effect that your fires are going to have are going to be diminished.
But in the initial phase of any conflict, some experts say that Russia would likely opt for weapons that can operate in any weather, long-range artillery, ballistic missiles. they would seek to take out Ukrainian command and control, not frontline forces. Satellite imagery indicates that such weapons have been brought forward to positions near the Ukrainian border. The Russian military, both on the ground and in the air, has been significantly upgraded over the course of the last decade, and it trains to operate in all weather conditions. But even in the 21st century, weather matters. And the forecast for the rest of February is for milder than normal conditions and plenty of cloud cover. Melissa Bell, CNN, Kyiv.
And coupled with that, Russia continues to say that it has no intention to invade Ukraine. But what is it that makes the West suspect that this is not the correct assessment, either on Russia's part of their own intentions or, for that matter of fact, what the West believes will happen? And that's because there is precedence to this. Russia, according to the Western diplomats, had insisted that they will not tamper with Crimea in 2014, and then an annexation happened. So they say there is precedence, and that is why they are worried. That's it then for the moment. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.